Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 17 of APUSH. We are still talking about how revolutionary was the revolution, and we haven't really gotten to the final aspect, which I don't want to say is the most important, but it probably might be the most important into leading to the Constitution. So let's go ahead and start with this. And your first question is the classic one. To what extent did the finance, trade, and economy, as discussed in your textbook, experience an economic revolution? Please hit pause if you need to. Consider the question for as long as you need to, and come back. And I don't know if this is the argument of historians, but my argument might be that, or this would be, that overall, for the long term, the economy probably experienced the largest amount of revolution. And there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, trade issues. The United States lost its greatest trade partner. So what you're seeing here with this image is the triangular trade, and you can see the lot of it goes through the British West Indies. I mean, all these goods, so manufactured goods are no longer necessarily being sent to the colonies. The colonies are not allowed to send all of their stuff to the British West Indies. All of this is being interrupted. And probably the biggest thing is, and you can see that because before the war, almost 60% of northern exports had gone through the West Indies. And in the South, I think the textbook mentions that 66% of their produce of whatever they had made was shipped to Great Britain. And so if that is being disrupted, how do you make up for that? And of course, Americans will make up for it by smuggling because they don't care. But that's going to be hard to pull off for everyone. And so you're going to see a New England economy that is significantly depressed, especially because of this, whereas the Southern economy might not be affected as much because they can find new trading partners for their raw materials a little bit easier than New England can suddenly switch from getting all of their manufactured goods from one place. So because of this, an economic depression did grip the country, but also you had some of the problems with money going on. So it's not just that you had a trade problem, and I forgot to mention, the articles gave no power to the national government created under the articles to control commerce. And then on top of that, you had a monetary problem in the early United States. They had issued these, which were called Continentals. And if we read this one, which is really clear, this bill entitles the bearer to receive 3 Spanish milled dollars. So what that means is gold, specie, a coin that is weighted with gold that everyone in the world determines has money. This piece of paper is a piece of paper. It has no real value unless you can exchange it. Back then, unless you can exchange it for specie. So this is a $3 Continental. Down here you have a $20 Continental. And while Continental Congress took to printing money as well as, so both of these are national Continental Congress money, so did states. Printed money to raise money for the war. And as everything kind of lags, by 1780, there was so much money out in circulation that a lot of people didn't want to accept Continentals because they were so prevalent. And you might not be able to get back your actual specie if you presented it. And that was only made worse by a Second Continental Congress Declaration by 1780 that repudiated the actual 1-to-1 ratio that you see mentioned here in both of these and went to a 40-to-1 ratio, which really probably wasn't representative of what they were worth, but they were probably worth less, to tell you the truth. I think your textbook mentions that 100 Continentals might be worth 1 Spanish milled piece of specie or specie in general. So people stop accepting continentals. So the economy starts not shutting down, but having major issues. And because Congress simply couldn't just raise taxes, especially under the Articles, bills aren't being paid. People who are submitting these for repayment aren't being allowed to. There is an economic depression from a trade issue, but also from a monetary issue. So this is a major economic revolution for the United States. It's a negative revolution, but it's a revolution nonetheless. So you might go, well, did the Articles do anything that was good? And that leads us to this question. And again, I would argue that this is a large degree of revolution. And I don't have the map coming up here, but the very first thing you need to realize is there were overlapping claims. So Virginia claimed all this land. Pennsylvania claimed all this land. Connecticut, Rhode Island. Every colony claimed their borders all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So one thing that the Articles did was to repudiate these Western claims. And then once that was done, you had to decide how the land in the Western territories, and remember that, well, not remember, but notice that the Northwest ordinances are really only dealing with these territories. They are not dealing with the Southern territories because those are more in dispute. I mean, the Spanish claims, Native American claims, even though Britain had given control of those areas to the United States, those aren't really areas that people are moving into as rapidly as they are moving into these Northwest areas. And so because new Americans are moving rapidly into, you have to figure out how you're going to organize it. So the land ordinance of 1785 surveyed and sectioned these areas in a grid-like fashion. And then the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 created a process for statehood. So when are you a territory? When can you write a temporary constitution? And when can you actually apply for statehood? And on the slide here, you see that the numerical population numbers for each of those. And then really important, especially later on, to the idea of what will lead to the Civil War is that Congress, under the Articles, actually does ban slavery in these areas, creating a precedent for a national group to ban slavery. So Northerners are not constantly, but they're going to point to this in the pre-Civil War era as, look, we've done this before. Why can't we ban slavery in the areas gained from the Mexican War or the Louisiana Purchase or things like that? But at this time, I don't think this was all that controversial. Slavery at this point is still, I think there are many Americans who are willing to ban slavery because slavery is not terribly profitable still in 1787. It takes till 1793 when the cotton gin is invented and you get this massive increase in the ability to produce cotton lint specifically, that you see Southerners start to really hold on, all Southerners starting to hold on to slavery. The other thing about this land policy is it did lead to Indian wars. As Americans move into this area, guess what? They're going to meet Native Americans who have lived in this area, either being pushed during the initial colonial era or just have been there originally. And so you see massive wars from really 1785 to 1795, where the new United States is battling with Native Americans in this area. The Articles of Confederation were visibly failures in other ways. Number one, you can see the problems of the Articles and its money-raising issues in the Newburgh Conspiracy, which was hatched, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes, by Hamilton because he wanted to create a crisis. He wanted to create a crisis by which not the United States would be overthrown, but that the Articles could be strengthened. So he convinced officers to say that they might rebel or they might create a coup under the Articles if they could not get paid. It wasn't intended to be a real coup, and by coup I mean C-O-U-P, the French word coup, an overthrow. It was meant to be a threat that would create Congress to go, oh my gosh, we've got to create a way to raise money because, you know, to pay the troops, you need to be able to tax. We have to tax by a 13 out of 13 number. We can't reach that number. Washington heard about this supposed coup, thought it was genuine, and he gave an impassioned speech to his former officers, which you can see here, in which apparently he put on his glasses, which was a sign of, I am admitting a weakness in front of you. I can't read without, and they were overcome by Washington's self-admitting of weakness, that they said that they would not overthrow the government, which they never intended to do, and which is one of the first instances where Alexander Hamilton starts to get a bad reputation. A reputation of, I will do almost whatever it takes to get what I want. And I know for some of you who are fans of Hamilton, including me, who have watched it on Disney or seen it live in person, you know that as the years progress, Hamilton continues to warrant a reputation of whatever I want, I will get one way or another. One thing I do want to point out about Hamilton is he's not doing this out of a personal goal of power. He's doing it out of a genuine sense of what the United States needs. The next area where it was clear that the Articles had failed was the idea of diplomacy. So, you know, I mean, as any country, the United States is going to have to be able to negotiate with other countries, whether it's for borders, whether it's for trade. And the United States in this early time, as I had mentioned earlier, this area of the United States, you know, I don't want to say that the Spanish were claiming it, but certainly the Spanish claimed that the Mississippi was theirs. This is Spanish territory. Well, the United States, if you've got this Northwest territory, or if you will eventually settle the Southwest territories, you need some sort of agreement on who can navigate the Mississippi. So the United States sent John Jay, who will later become the first Supreme Court Justice. He's also an author of, I believe, 5 of the Federalist Papers. They will send him to Spain to negotiate with Spain for a treaty of navigation and hopefully a treaty of what's called deposit. So the Mississippi empties in New Orleans. Well, New Orleans at this time, without a doubt, was under Spanish control. So it's almost no good to use the Mississippi if you can't also deposit your goods in New Orleans. And by deposit, you mean removing it from a river-worthy vessel into a seaworthy vessel. So you're putting it on a dock or in a warehouse or something and waiting for it to be removed to or moved to a seaworthy vessel. Well, John Jay returns with the treaty saying the United States cannot use the Mississippi and the United States does not have a right of deposit. He got nothing. He got zero. And a lot of people say he got zero because what was his trump card, so to speak? And I know that phrase has gotten not misused, but maybe not, it elicits chuckles. But a trump card means, like, what's your bargaining card? The United States doesn't have a bargaining card. There's no military. There's no finance. I mean, our finances are in ruin. Our trade is in ruin. Our military doesn't exist. Our government, our national government can't create any of these. So a Spanish empire, which by this point is beginning to crumble, why would they give in to the United States? So he brings back a treaty that gives nothing that the United States wants. And a lot of members of the national government under the Articles at that point go, we need a national policy of commerce. We need a national policy of taxation. And then on top of it, right after Gardaki's treaty, you get an actual rebellion in the United States, Shays Rebellion, which is not a rebellion against the government of the United States. It's a rebellion against really the concept of, are we better off under the United States than not? I mean, Massachusetts had set, as a lot of states had by that point, set to retiring its debt, its revolutionary debt, by increasing taxes. Now, these state governments could increase taxes much easier than the national government could. So you saw taxes going up on a state-by-state basis. Well, what happens when you can't pay your taxes? The government will seize your land. So there are soldiers who had fought for the revolution whose land was under threat of seizure by local counties and local governments because they could not pay their tax, which, by the way, was demanded in specie, which, remember, is hard money, rather than in continentals. So you can't pay your tax with these continentals because the state government's going, well, those are worthless. And so, and I think rightfully so, people like Daniel Shays, the leader of Shays Rebellion, say, no, we're not letting you issue these orders. So they actually came out in force. This is a highly dramatized version of what might have been going on during Shays Rebellion. But the problem, more or less, was there was no federal response because guess what? There's no army. So Massachusetts was left to try to put down a rebellion within their own states. There is no national response. People look at the national government as a point of weakness. And so this is 1786. And right there in 1786, you do get the Annapolis Convention, which was, hey, let's talk about how we can control commerce, maybe control trade, maybe get some tariffs going so we can raise money as a country so that we can have a military. And they decided at Annapolis, Maryland, that our problems aren't just commerce. We should propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. And they agreed to come to Philadelphia in 1787 and create a convention which would propose these amendments. But once they got there, their agreements were that so much needed to change that they should scrap the articles and create a new constitution. And here you see Barry, his name's Barry, back in 1934. I don't know very many Barrys. Barry Faulkner's painting from 1934, which shows the Constitutional Convention in almost Romanesque type of features. The father of the Constitution, I believe, is shown right here, and that's James Madison. Not really handing the Constitution to George Washington, but James Madison is considered the father of the Constitution because he wrote what was called the Virginia Plan. There were things all of the delegates there had an agreement. We need to make raising taxes easier. We need to create a regulation of interstate commerce. We need a military to keep the peace. But their disagreements were also huge. How do we balance large versus small state representation? The Virginia Plan, which was a large state representation, versus the New Jersey Plan, which was a small state representation. And they will come to a compromise, which we'll talk about later, called the Connecticut Compromise. How do we deal with slavery? And really the issue there wasn't so much do we keep it, but do slaves count as population for the purpose of representation? How do we balance, the third bullet point, the powers of a national government that we are talking about increasing versus a state government, which that was the whole point of the revolution. And a lot of this is solved by this concept of federalism, which is one of the most unique aspects in my mind of the US Constitution. How do we deal with voting on a national versus state level? And they're going to deal with that by not solving it. And all of that led to the creation of a document that we call the Constitution that first had to be ratified. And that's your homework, is to deal with the ratification battle over the Constitution. And then later we will talk about, since its ratification needed to happen first, Once it's ratified, which it does get ratified, sorry, plot ruining, then we'll talk about the actual particulars of the Constitution, which we will talk about in episode 18 coming up next, or we will begin to talk about.